Secretary was an astonishing advance, and a clear signal that Mrs. Thatcher regarded him as a potential successor.
How do you feel about being the youngest Foreign Secretary since Dr. David Owen 12 years ago?
Well, I'm not sure I myself would care to put it quite that way, but I'm very pleased to be Foreign Secretary.
What are the major issues? Oh, I think he was shattered. I think he was taken aback. I think he was knocked out, as they say. I remember him coming out of the study and thinking I had a sense of humour. I asked him what the capital of Ecuador was, and he couldn't answer, nor could I don't think. I took him off into a room close to the Prime Minister's study, and frankly, he sat down in a chair for a few minutes to recover and collect himself.
Suddenly, he was overwhelmed with the world, with a whole series of problems in different countries, different continents, which were new to him, except in the most elementary way. He was dismayed by the number and the complexity of the things that came at him out of his Foreign Office boxes.
John Major never had time to shine as Foreign Secretary. Mrs. Thatcher's powerful position on the world stage meant that she tended to eclipse him at meetings with world leaders. But his discomfort as Foreign Secretary did not last long. Margaret Thatcher's relations with her once revered Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, had broken down, and in October 1989, Lawson declared he could not go on and resigned. Once again, John Major was summoned to her presence.
Could it be a rocky week, Chancellor? She may have the reputation of being the Iron Lady in the public eye, but she's very human as well. And I think apart from the politics of it, she was hurt. And it seemed to me that she was fairly close to tears, and I just put my hand out and put my hand over her hand for a moment or two while we talked about what might happen.
The Prime Minister appointed John Major Chancellor of the Exchequer. He had been Foreign Secretary for only 94 days. Once more, he was in his element. At the Treasury, he loved. If Mrs. Thatcher was unaware of the political beliefs of her protégé, it was partly because she had never given him breathing space to develop them.
I was moving through government faster than a counter goes around the monopoly board. So there wasn't a great deal of time to step back and make philosophic speeches. I was too busy dealing with the practicalities of the day. I wasn't hiding my views. Those people who knew me knew my views very well.
Now, as Chancellor, he had the opportunity to make those views plain to the world. To Mrs. Thatcher's horror, John Major insisted on Britain joining Europe's exchange rate mechanism, the ERM, in order to fight inflation.
Sometime later, Lady Thatcher wrote that I was drifting intellectually with the tide, the pro-European tide. Well, if that was her view, she certainly didn't say so at the time. She certainly didn't say so to me, and she certainly did not advance that as an argument for changing the policy that I was advocating.
John Major did show a certain amount of steel because she couldn't lose two chancellors. And if the new chancellor came along and argued that we should be joining the ERM, Margaret didn't really have an alternative. Even Margaret Thatcher at that stage could not simply slung out another Chancellor of the Exchequer and try to find one that agreed with her. And into the ERM we went.
Just as Mrs. Thatcher was declining, John Major was in the ascendant. By taking Britain into the ERM, he confirmed his power over the now vulnerable Prime Minister and placed himself in pole position in the race to succeed her, whether he wished it or not.
I never had a game plan about what the next job would be and whether I would become Prime Minister. Lots of people have subsequently suggested that I did, but I didn't. I operated largely by what I think was the Ian MacLeod maxim. If the ball comes in your direction, grab it. And in politics, the ball often came in my direction, and I did grab it. Is this for next Friday?
No, this is. Okay. I had observed him when he was Chancellor and I was Chief Secretary, and one of the things I noticed was that John spent an amazing amount of time, a truly astonishing amount of time, speaking in MPs' constituencies, to their associations, their businessmen's clubs, and he was remarkably assiduous.
I did one for
There is no doubt in my mind that he was thinking about becoming Prime Minister and had been thinking for quite some time.
Right.
In public, John Major was as loyal as ever to the woman who had advanced him so far and so fast. But privately, he was beginning to have doubts about her continuing ability to lead the party.
It seemed to me that Margaret was no longer examining the facts before reaching the decision. She was operating on gut instinct. And from time to time, one saw ideas put forward, perhaps sometimes tossed forward quite loosely, that just ran into the slammed door of a closed mind.
In the spring of 1990, riots had broken out in central London over the poll tax, a policy very close to Mrs. Thatcher's heart. She clung doggedly to it despite massive opposition, not only in the streets, but also in Parliament and Cabinet. After more than a decade in power, many felt the unrest was the surest sign that she had lost her grip.
No, no, no.
And her attitude to Europe caused confusion at summits and reinforced many of her colleagues' concerns about her leadership.
The problem was mainly that Margaret was suddenly becoming more anti-European than she'd been before. She was always instinctively not very pro-European, but she was going quite vehemently anti. And I think, frankly, in the last year or two, Margaret was beginning to get more individual and pursuing her own moods and whims in the government, and was perhaps slightly losing touch. Good morning.
On the 14th of November, Mrs. Thatcher's sworn enemy, Michael Heseltine, announced that he was challenging the Prime Minister for the leadership of the Conservative Party. His decision was triggered by the resignation of Sir Geoffrey Howe. Heseltine had stormed out of the Cabinet nearly 5 years before. John Major, Chancellor of the Exchequer, was the insider's favourite for the top job should she fall. But he was giving nothing away.
The Prime Minister has been nominated by the Foreign Secretary, seconded by me. We expect her to win. We hope she will win. We hope she will remain leader of the Conservative Party.
Are you confident
I hope and expect and am confident that that will be the case. It's certainly the best outcome.
What happens if she doesn't win on the first ballot, Mr. Major?
She will.
Mrs. Thatcher, could I ask...
Mrs. Thatcher was in Paris when the result of the first ballot came through. She was badly wounded.
I'm very pleased that I got more than half the parliamentary party and disappointed that it's not quite enough to win on the first ballot. So I confirm it is my intention to let my name go forward for the second ballot.
The next day she returned to London, apparently determined to continue. That afternoon, Mrs. Thatcher telephoned John Major. He was at home after an operation on his teeth.
The first thing she said in a rather breathy way straight away was, "I want you to second my nomination." And she wrote later that there was a palpable pause. And there was. There was a palpable pause. I did pause. And it wasn't because I was disinclined to support her. I was always prepared to support her and second her nomination. It was because that approach, after a bad first-round ballot defeat, was exactly what had caused her so much difficulty in the party. This peremptory assumption. It was just, I would like you to second my nomination. And it seemed to me that that was exactly the mistake of man management. And that was the reason for the pause.
John Major, closeted at home in Huntingdon, was recovering from his wisdom tooth operation. His lack of enthusiasm might have had another motive. Away from the fevered atmosphere of Westminster, he was aware that the crown was about to pass from Mrs. Thatcher. It could well pass to him. By keeping his head down at home, he did very little to help the beleaguered Prime Minister, but escaped charges of disloyalty. He sent out a handwritten note to reporters, saying only that he anticipated seconding her in the next ballot.
It was poor repayment for what she had done for him. John Major certainly owed everything to Margaret Thatcher, but of course gratitude is a rare commodity in politics, and it shouldn't be expected too much.
I was not an eager entrant into the fray, and I would have preferred to have stayed a good deal longer at the job that I'd always wished to have, that of Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was not a terribly convenient time for me to move on to be Prime Minister. You can't turn it down if it happens, but it was not a terribly convenient time. I was not sitting there thirsting to become Prime Minister.
When I discussed with him tentatively the idea of standing or being leader, he would say, well, I'm not sure that I'm ready for it. He did say that. And he did also say, I'm not sure that I want it. But I think he did want to be Prime Minister. Of course, people can have two thoughts in their minds at one time.
It was left to John Major's colleagues to deal the fatal blow to the Prime Minister and remove her from office. On the evening of the 21st of November, they went one by one to Westminster and told Margaret Thatcher that with so little support in the first ballot, she was finished and had to go. The following day, she confirmed her resignation to Cabinet. The news was announced to an astonished world.
It looked as though Heseltine might inherit. That would have been dreadful. Apart from anything else, any difficulties which the party has had since would have been as nothing had the man that pulled her down succeeded her. And so there was a look around everywhere, well, who else could succeed her? And the field was not terribly good. Acorns seldom grow under the great oak.
John Major was the obvious candidate. On the day Mrs. Thatcher resigned, he returned from Huntingdon to confirm he was standing, with her blessing.
Why you decided to stand?
I believe I would like the opportunity of trying to unite the party. A lot of colleagues have suggested to me that I may be able to do so.
The battle to replace Margaret Thatcher began.
So nice to see you again so speedily.
The Major campaign team was led by Norman Lamont, with William Hague in attendance. Norman Lamont then shared Mrs. Thatcher's view that he was sound on the most important issue.
One of the main reasons that I supported John Major enthusiastically was that I felt he was much more cautious about Europe than Michael Heseltine or Douglas Hurd. And that was why I and many other people backed him.
Two others were standing, Michael Heseltine and Douglas Hurd. Michael Heseltine may have been the most charismatic of the three candidates, but for most Conservative MPs, his role as the assassin of Margaret Thatcher put him beyond the pale.
Yeah, they'll all speak for themselves, and I've made it quite clear that I'm the Truman of this campaign, the David fighting off the backbenchers, the little guy, but the little guy who's going to win.
Quite a big little guy.
The Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd had the backing of many party grandees, but was considered by colleagues to be too old-fashioned and stuffy. His efforts to play down his old Etonian background backfired disastrously. John Major seemed a much better bet to win the next general election.
Are you a fatalist, Mr. Major?
I'm an optimist.
At 47, he was the youngest contender. Despite the moderate tone of his campaign, Mrs. Thatcher remained right behind him.
She was assiduous. She threw herself into the campaign completely, putting great pressure on people. She thought that John Major was the nearest that there was available to someone who was going to continue her legacy. I think possibly also it may be a sort of therapy that, having not campaigned for herself, the thing to do in the aftermath of the terrible loss of office, which was like a bereavement to her, was to throw herself energetically into a campaign.
I was having lunch with some friends in the country, and the telephone rang, and it was Margaret Thatcher on the phone. And she was very brisk in her normal style. She just simply said, "Hello, Simon, he's pure gold." And I kind of startled at this, and I thought, you know, partly who and what. He's pure gold, pure gold.
But Mrs. Thatcher's interventions were not always welcome. During a farewell visit to Conservative Central Office, she said that whilst she might be leaving John Major at the controls, she would still be a very good backseat driver.
I was very alarmed. I was very alarmed because I could